Deshaun Watson just got named the Week 1 starter for the Cleveland Browns. Todd Monken spent the whole offseason insisting the competition was still open, and then he made the call. Here's what almost nobody is talking about yet, and it changes how you should be watching the next month of Browns football. One ESPN analyst has already put a 2-game expiration date on this decision, predicting on national television that Shedeur Sanders could take over if Watson struggles.
I think they have set this up in a way where they have guaranteed themselves that Deshaun Watson will never get booed at home again.
That's not a hot take from some rage-bait channel farming outrage. That's Booger McFarland on First Take describing this quarterback decision like it's a hostage negotiation. And the analyst next to him went a step further. He put an actual date on when this ends.
If he doesn't perform well on those first 2 games on the road, I think it's very possible that we could see Shedeur Sanders at home in Week 3 versus the Carolina Panthers.
That's Jason McCourty telling you on national television that Shedeur Sanders could be starting at home in Week 3. Not in November, not after some slow burn benching in Week 9. Week 3. That's his prediction, not a fact Cleveland has confirmed. So here's what I want you thinking about before we go any further. If a national analyst is already naming the exact week for a possible switch before Watson's thrown a single regular season pass, did Watson actually win this job, or did he simply fail to lose it badly enough for Cleveland to go with Shedeur instead? Because Colin Cowherd isn't exactly being subtle about where the football world actually lands on this, underneath all the Todd Monken believes in Deshaun quotes you've been fed for 3 weeks straight.
If I told you, let me give you 4 of the worst moves in the history of pro sports ever.
And Watson's contract made that list, right next to the Angels letting Shohei Ohtani walk for absolutely nothing. That's the company this decision is keeping in the national conversation right now, whether Cleveland wants to admit it or not. Let's actually get into it. What is the real reason the Browns picked Watson? What's the actual plan buried underneath the press conference talking points? And what does it tell you that some of the biggest names in football media are already predicting the ending? Let's back up and get the actual football part straight first, because that's where this gets complicated instead of simple. Cleveland's coaching staff spent the entire preseason evaluating both quarterbacks, and on Monday, August 24th, Todd Monken made it official. Watson starts Week 1 on the road in Jacksonville. Shedeur Sanders sits behind him as the leading alternative. Mark Schlereth, 3-time Super Bowl champion, not a guy who needs to manufacture outrage for clicks, broke down exactly why on his own show, and he didn't let anybody off easy. Not Watson, not Shedeur, not the fan base.
There's got to be no doubt. You have got to step up and you've got to earn it. You've got to take it from Deshaun Watson. And I did not think Shedeur did that.
Schlereth's actual argument is more nuanced than either side of this debate wants it to be. He thought Sanders played better in the second preseason game. He also thought Sanders was protected better. A cleaner pocket, more time to let a deep route develop, an easier look overall. Watson, by comparison, took hits behind backups the entire time he was in the game. Schlereth's real standard here isn't who had the better box score. It's did the challenger make it undeniable? And in his eyes, across 2 uneven preseason performances from both guys, Sanders didn't clear that bar high enough to take a starting job away from a quarterback the franchise is paying huge money to. But go back and listen to what Schlereth actually said right after that. He didn't say Watson looked good. He said the opposite. He said he didn't think either quarterback performed exceptionally well across the 2 preseason games, and he singled out Sanders' own Week 1 interception as, in his words, just an awful throw, shooting down the excuse that the ball was wet that night by saying it flat out doesn't matter. You've got to be able to execute regardless. So even the analyst making the strongest case for keeping Watson isn't telling you Watson earned this job outright. He's telling you Shedeur simply didn't take it from him decisively enough, mistakes and all on both sides. That's a very different message than Watson deserved this, and it's worth sitting with that distinction before you decide who the villain of this story actually is. And Schlereth went further than most channels have been willing to go on Watson specifically. He watched that post-game press conference, the one where Watson complained about being booed and brought up the Achilles injury, and he didn't hold back on what it revealed to him about Watson's mental state heading into a make-or-break season. He said bluntly that if complaints about a hostile crowd are the kind of thing Watson can't get past, it raises a real question about whether he can amount to anything at this stage of his career, 30 years old by Schlereth's own count, and without much game action to lean on the last few years. Here's where it gets uncomfortable though, because didn't clear the bar and this was purely a football decision are 2 very different claims, and the second one gets a lot harder to defend once you follow the money.
There's 46 million reasons why this decision was made the way it was.
Sure. Quick clarity on the numbers because these 2 get blurred constantly. The $230 million is the original, fully guaranteed contract Cleveland signed in 2022. The $46 million is what's sitting directly on Cleveland's books for Watson in 2026 alone. Schlereth's math isn't abstract. That's guaranteed money owed this season, whether Watson is throwing touchdowns or throwing his own fan base into a media firestorm. That creates an enormous financial incentive to at least try to get value from Watson before this contract finally runs its course. It doesn't prove the decision was about money instead of football, but it means you can't evaluate this as if money isn't part of the equation, even though Cleveland says it is purely about football. Cowherd made basically the same point from a different angle, ranking this contract alongside the actual worst front office decisions in modern sports: the Raiders hiring a GM and head coach off television, Dan Snyder handing the keys to Steve Spurrier, the Angels letting Shohei Ohtani leave for nothing. His reasoning wasn't about Watson's talent, it was about the sequence, as Cowherd tells it. Watson and his own agent told Cleveland he was out of the running in mid-March of 2022, and one day later, Cleveland fully guaranteed him $230 million anyway. That's Cowherd's framing of how this deal came together, not a neutral timeline, but it's exactly why he calls it panic dressed up as conviction, and why the Browns are locked into it no matter who's actually playing better in August. Here's where the schedule makes First Take's prediction a lot easier to buy into. Watson's first two starts aren't in Cleveland, they're on the road. Jacksonville, then Tampa. 2 road games before Watson would have to face Cleveland's home crowd again in Week 3. There's no evidence the Browns deliberately built that stretch as protection for Watson. That's not something Monken or the front office has said. But it does mean the entire "is this leash real?" question gets answered fast, and it gets answered before Watson ever has to stand back in front of the fans who booed him in August.
If he does not play well against Jacksonville and Tampa, he will never play another snap for the Cleveland Browns, and Shedeur will start Week 3. That's how this is set up for. It's a 2-week tryout to never get booed again at home.
Read that again. That's one ESPN analyst prediction, not a rule Cleveland has put in writing, and it directly clashes with what Todd Monken actually said out loud. In that same press conference, right after naming Watson the starter, Monken said this isn't a week-to-week decision. 2 very different messages, coming out of the same 48 hours. The head coach saying there's no trigger date, and a national analyst insisting there already is one. Both can't be fully right, and only one side of that gets to be true once the games actually kick off. And that matters even more once you remember how Watson has responded to pressure so far this preseason. Because after an ugly preseason performance in front of his own home crowd, he didn't take it. He pushed back and made it personal.
They booed you Saturday because you were awful. You had a 14 passer rating.
That's Cowherd's direct response to Watson calling the booing personal and bringing up his Achilles tear from years ago as the reason the fan base turned. And here's the actual problem with that response, for Watson specifically, going forward. He's about to walk into 2 road stadiums full of people who have 0 personal history with him. Nobody in Jacksonville has a grudge about an Achilles tear. Nobody in Tampa cares about old Cleveland beef. If he struggles in either building, there's no crowd left to blame and no old wound to point back to. Just him, the offense, and a stat line that every major sports media outlet in the country is already primed and waiting to pounce on. And this is bigger than one contract or one quarterback controversy in one city, because whatever happens over these next 2 games doesn't just decide who starts in Week 3. It might decide what's left of Deshaun Watson's NFL career, period.
He has been awful, like an abject disaster since that game.
Cowherd's talking about the January 2020 playoff collapse against Kansas City. Watson's Texans led that game 24-0 and lost by 20 points. Cowherd's argument, and it's his opinion, not a box score, is that this collapse marks the beginning of the end of the quarterback people once viewed as a franchise cornerstone. Everything since, the trade to Cleveland, the suspension, the lawsuits, the $230 million fully guaranteed contract, has been, in his read, the rest of the league watching that talent evaporate in real time. And the panel on First Take took that thought all the way to its most brutal conclusion.
There are 32 teams in the NFL. Only one is giving him the opportunity to be a starter.
That's the panel's read on Watson's market value around the league right now. Not a league-wide survey, just their honest assessment. And they didn't stop there. They named the one franchise, once his Browns tenure is finally over, that could plausibly bring him in as a backup without his name becoming the whole story again. Kansas City, big enough and deep enough at quarterback that Watson would never be the headline there. That's not a criticism of his arm talent anymore. That's 2 national analysts telling you they think the league has already made up its mind about who Deshaun Watson is, no matter what Cleveland's coaching staff says at a podium in August. And there's one more detail from that First Take breakdown that tells you exactly how cynical this has gotten, even among people who aren't trying to be cynical about it. The panel framed these next 2 starts, bluntly, as Cleveland's chance to get a little something back in the aftermath of that $230 million fully guaranteed investment, before they ever move on to Sanders for good. Not develop him, not build around him. Get something back. That's the actual language being used on national television about a starting NFL quarterback 3 weeks before the season opens. When the national conversation around your franchise quarterback sounds like a business trying to recoup a bad purchase instead of a football team building a roster, that tells you everything about where this has actually landed. So here's where this actually leaves us. Todd Monken says this wasn't about the money. He says he watched the tape, the joint practices, the entire body of work, and believed Watson gives Cleveland the best chance to win football games right now. Maybe that's completely true. Maybe Monken genuinely sees something in that quarterback room that the stat sheets, the national panels, and 3-time Super Bowl champions on podcasts don't. But you don't need to pick a side blindly here, because the schedule itself is doing a lot of the talking. 2 road games before Cleveland's home crowd sees him again, a first-time head coach publicly insisting there's no trigger date while protecting a guaranteed contract that makes the alternative brutally expensive, and a national media class that has already sketched out an ending before Watson has thrown one real pass that counts. And to be fair to Monken here, because this channel isn't in the business of manufacturing villains where the tape doesn't support one, he didn't create this contract, he inherited it, the same way he inherited a fan base that had already turned on Watson before Monken ever got the job. Whatever you think of the decision itself, the man calling this a football call is not the same man who guaranteed $230 million to begin with. That distinction matters, even if it doesn't change what happens over the next 2 weeks. Here's my actual prediction. If Watson wins in Jacksonville and Tampa, or even splits those two, this entire conversation goes quiet, right up until the moment it doesn't. But if he loses both and loses ugly, I'd expect the pressure to turn to Shedeur Sanders in week 3 to become almost impossible for Cleveland to ignore, no matter how many times Monken says this isn't week to week. Cleveland will call it a football decision the entire time, and every single person covering this story right now, Slareth, Cowherd, the whole First Take panel, will say they called it before it happened. So here's what I actually want to know from you. Did Watson actually win this job, or did he just fail to lose it badly enough for Cleveland to turn to Shedeur instead? Get into the comments and tell me I'm wrong. I'll see you in the next one.